Victoria Grace didn't feel the cold steel of the beretta pressed against her temple. She only felt the frantic, irregular thrum of the heart beneath her palms. The bedroom was an altar of gold and mahogany, but the air tasted of copper and impending death. Simone DeRose leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame, his breath a ragged snarl against her ear. "You have 30 seconds, he whispered, a sound more terrifying than a scream. "If my mother's heart stops, yours stops one heartbeat later." Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't beg for her life or mention the cleaning bucket she had dropped in the hallway. Instead, she shoved his gun hand away with a strength born of pure adrenaline. "Then stop wasting my time and hold her head back," she barked, her voice cutting through the panic of the gathered guards like a scalpel. The room froze. No one spoke to Simone DeRose that way and lived. But Simone, seeing the clinical fire in Victoria's eyes, the eyes of a doctor, not a maid, he obeyed. He dropped to his knees on the silk sheets, his tattooed fingers trembling as he stabilized his mother's neck. Victoria's mind raced through a mental textbook she hadn't opened in years. The matriarch's skin was a sickly translucent gray, her pulse a chaotic mess. "Digitalis," Victoria muttered, spotting the yellow-tinted vomit on the lace pillowcase. "She's been overdosed. It's not a heart attack, it's toxicity." She didn't have a crash cart or a pharmacy. She lunged for her discarded cleaning kit, ripping open a bottle of specialized saline solution and grabbing a heavy silver letter opener from the nightstand. With the precision of a surgeon, she improvised. She needed to stabilize the woman's potassium levels before the heart's electrical system short-circuited forever. "What are you doing?" Simone demanded, his grip tightening on his mother's hand as Victoria prepared to move. "Saving the only person you love," Victoria countered, her gaze meeting his for a fraction of a second. In that moment, the predator's mask slipped, and she saw the raw, bleeding soul of a son terrified of being alone. "Now, keep her still. If I miss the vein, we both die." The guards watched, fingers twitching on triggers, as the invisible woman who usually polished their boots began to fight the Reaper for the soul of the DeRose empire. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like a hammer blow. 20 seconds left. 15. Victoria's hands were steady, her focus absolute, as she performed the unthinkable. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was the only god in the room, and Simone DeRose was merely her witness. Welcome to Favy Love Stories. Like and hit the subscribe button now because there are many more stories like this coming your way. Tune in for more danger, desire, and unforgettable tales. Now let's begin. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the DeRose penthouse, illuminating floating dust motes and the expensive, silent geometry of the furniture. Victoria Grace moved like a shadow across the marble, her hands clad in yellow latex, her mind miles away in a lecture hall she hadn't stepped inside of for 3 years. She was mentally reciting the cranial nerves to keep her sanity while she scrubbed the baseboards, a brilliant mind reduced to the rhythm of soap and water. She heard him before she saw him. The heavy, rhythmic stride of Italian leather on stone heralded the arrival of Simone DeRose. Victoria kept her head bowed, her heart doing a nervous staccato against her ribs. He was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he reconfigured its gravity. As he passed, the scent of expensive tobacco and bergamot trailed in his wake, a masculine fragrance that felt dangerously like a physical touch. Victoria shifted her bucket to reach the far corner, her movements usually precise and invisible. But today, the lack of sleep and the persistent ache in her lower back betrayed her. A single, rogue drop of soapy water leaped from the rag, arching through the air before landing squarely on the polished toe of Simone's bespoke shoe. The world stopped. Simone came to a halt, his silence more deafening than any shout. Victoria stared at the tiny, translucent bead of water sitting on the flawless black leather. She felt the weight of his gaze before she looked up, and when she did, she found him staring down at her. His eyes were the color of a stormy Mediterranean sea, cold, deep, and devastatingly beautiful. I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out instinctively with her dry cloth. "Let me just." "Don't touch me," he said. The words weren't loud, but they carried the edge of a razor. He didn't move his foot, he simply stood there, looking at her as if she were a glitch in a high-end machine. There was a sudden, electric charge in the space between them, a friction that had nothing to do with the cleaning. For a heartbeat, his eyes searched hers, lingering on the intelligence he found behind her submissive posture. It was a look of recognition, a spark of something primal and hungry that made Victoria's breath catch in her throat. Then, the mask of the dawn returned. The heat vanished, replaced by a glacial indifference. "You're careless, Victoria," he said, calling her by name for the first and last time. "And in this house, a single mistake is the end of the line. Pack your things. You're fired." "Mr. DeRose, please," she pleaded, thinking of the rent and the medicine her mother needed. "It was just a drop of water." "It's never just a drop," he replied, turning his back on her as if she had already ceased to exist. "It's the lack of discipline it represents. Leave now, before I decide to be less generous with your severance." Victoria stood alone in the center of the vast, cold room, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than the chemical scent of the bleach in her bucket. She was invisible again, but as she walked away, she felt his eyes on her back, a lingering warmth that suggested that despite his words, Simone DeRose wouldn't find it quite so easy to forget her. The sun had begun to dip behind the Roman skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the cobblestones that mirrored the fractured state of Victoria's life. 6 days. That was the deadline her landlord had snarled at her through a cracked door. 6 days to find the rent or find the curb. The weight of the world felt heavier with every step she took away from the DeRose penthouse, her dismissal still ringing in her ears like a physical blow. She had exactly 43 euros to her name and a mother in Napoli whose heart medication was running dangerously low. Poverty wasn't just a lack of money, it was a thief that stole your dignity and replaced it with a permanent knot of panic in the center of your chest. She was sitting on a cold stone bench near the Tiber River when her phone buzzed with a notification from a secure, anonymous labor app used by the city's most desperate workers. It was a black label request, a deep clean assignment for a private estate on the outskirts of the city. The pay was 500 euros for a single night's work, cash in hand. It was 10 times the market rate, a sum that screamed of secrets and danger. In Rome, 500 euros bought more than just clean floors, it bought silence. Victoria stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the accept button. Her medical training whispered a warning, this was the kind of job where people disappeared, but the image of her mother's empty pill bottles shouted louder. She pressed the button. Within seconds, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, its engine purring with a predatory smoothness. The drive was silent. The city lights faded into the dark, rolling hills of the countryside until they reached a high iron gate guarded by men who didn't look like security guards, but like soldiers. As the car wound up the gravel driveway of the massive villa, Victoria felt a strange sense of fate pulling at her. She realized with a jolt of electricity through her veins that she was being brought back into the orbit of the man who had destroyed her life that morning. She was led through a side entrance by a man with a scarred face who didn't care to know her name. "The main wing needs a deep scrub," he muttered, thrusting a heavy bag of industrial supplies into her hands. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look at anything but the floor. If you see blood, you keep scrubbing until it's gone." Victoria gripped the handle of the cleaning bucket, her knuckles white. The air inside the villa was thick with the scent of old wood, expensive wax, and something metallic that made her medical instincts flare. She was back in the lion's den, walking the halls of the DeRose estate as a ghost. She didn't know that within the hour, her hands would be covered in more than just soap, and that the man who had fired her with such cold indifference was about to become the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. The silence of the DeRose villa was shattered by a sound Victoria recognized from the darkest corners of her clinical rotations, the death rattle of a failing respiratory system. She abandoned her bucket in the darkened hallway, following the noise into a bedroom draped in heavy velvet and the scent of expensive, stale lilies. There, the matriarch lay convulsing, her face a terrifying shade of ashen violet. Standing over her was Simone, his composure stripped away, leaving behind a man who looked like he was watching his entire world collapse. "She's not breathing," Simone roared as Victoria burst through the doors. The guards moved to block her, their hands reaching for holsters, but Simone's eyes met Victoria's. In that desperate gaze, the cold dawn disappeared, replaced by a sun pleading for a miracle. "Do something." Victoria dropped to her knees by the bed, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace that betrayed her humble maid's uniform. She checked the woman's pulse. It was dangerously slow, a thready bradycardia that skipped every third beat. She looked at the woman's eyes, noting the way the pupils were constricted, and then her eyes fell on a small, spilled bottle of heart medication on the nightstand. "She told me the lights looked strange," Simone whispered, his voice cracking. "She said everything in the room had a yellow glow." Victoria's blood went cold. "It's not a heart attack," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of the room. "It's digitalis toxicity." She looked up at the viewers of the unfolding tragedy. To understand what was happening to the matriarch, one must understand that digitalis, or digoxin, is a drug derived from the foxglove plant. While it helps a weak heart pump more efficiently, the line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one is razor thin. When the levels become toxic, it poisons the heart's electrical system. One of the most distinct clinical signs is xanthopsia, a disturbance in vision where everything appears tinted with a yellow or green halo. The matriarch wasn't just sick, she had been systematically poisoned until her heart's internal clock began to fail. Victoria knew that without immediate intervention to stabilize her potassium and neutralize the drug, the woman's heart would simply stop. "She's seeing yellow because her nervous system is saturated with the toxin," Victoria explained to a stunned Simone. "Her heart is under a chemical blockade." She saw the suspicious glares of the guards, but she didn't care. She reached into her medical past, knowing she had to act as the bridge between life and death. With no specialized antidote in sight, she began to bark orders for high-dose saline and a makeshift cardiac stimulant. She was no longer the woman who had spilled water on a shoe. She was a healer standing in the center of a mafia war, fighting a silent assassin with nothing but her intellect and a desperate hope for a second chance. The adrenaline that had sustained Victoria through the crisis ebbed away, leaving her limbs heavy and her mind clouded with the realization of her new reality. The matriarch was stable, her breathing now a rhythmic lullaby in the quiet room, but Victoria was far from free. Simone DeRose stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the moonlit Roman hills. He hadn't thanked her, not in words, but he had dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist, leaving them alone in the vast, gilded silence of the suite. "You aren't leaving," Simone said, his voice no longer the roar of a predator, but a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in Victoria's very chest. He didn't turn around, but she could see his reflection in the glass. "The doctor who was supposed to be here is dead. My mother is only alive because of a maid who knows too much about cardiac toxicity. Until I know who switched those pills, you are the safest person in Italy, and the most captive." He finally turned, and the harsh overhead lights of the bedroom were off, replaced by the soft, amber glow of a single desk lamp. In the dimness, the terrifying dawn looked human. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the intricate ink that climbed his throat. To Victoria's surprise, he wasn't looking at her with suspicion, but with a weary, profound curiosity. "You're a doctor," he stated, moving toward a small table where a bottle of vintage red wine sat untouched. He poured a glass and held it out to her. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, and the contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was a magnetic, confusing heat. "Why were you scrubbing my floors, Victoria?" She took a slow sip, the wine tasting of dark cherries and earth. "Life doesn't always care about degrees, Mr. DeRose. Papers get lost. Debts get called in. Sometimes, the only way to save a life is to disappear into the shadows." Simone stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the bergamot and the faint, metallic scent of the evening's violence. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his thumb gently brushed a smudge of grime from her cheek, a smudge she had earned while saving his mother. The gesture was shockingly tender, a stark contrast to the man who had fired her with a sneer only hours ago. "I destroyed your life this morning," he murmured, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. And tonight, you saved mine. My mother is my world, Victoria. If I lose her, I lose the last piece of myself that isn't a monster. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't the master and she wasn't the servant. They were two broken souls in a house of secrets. As Simone leaned in, his forehead nearly touching hers, Victoria realized that her gilded cage was more dangerous than she'd thought, not because of the locks on the doors, but because of the man holding the key. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 3 in the morning, the sound echoing through the silent, marble-clad halls of the villa. Victoria wandered into the vast, darkened kitchen, her heart still hammering against her ribs from the night's terror. Her hands were shaking as she reached for a glass, but a sharp sting in her palm made her hiss in pain. During the frantic struggle to save the matriarch, a shard of the broken medicine vial had sliced deep into her flesh, an injury she had been too saturated with adrenaline to notice until now. "You should have told me you were hurt." The voice was low, vibrating through the shadows. Simone stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing, yet he had discarded his tie and rolled his sleeves up, revealing the powerful cords of his forearms. He didn't wait for her permission. He walked toward her with a predatory grace that shifted into something softer as he reached for her hand. His touch was warm, his large, calloused fingers cradling her wrist with a gentleness that felt like a secret. He led her to the central island and sat her down on a high stool. Without a word, he retrieved a first aid kit, moving with an efficiency that suggested he was no stranger to treating wounds. The moonlight spilled through the window, silvering the space between them. As he began to clean the cut with an antiseptic wipe, Victoria gasped at the sting. "Easy," he murmured, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her inner wrist to soothe her. "I've spent my life causing wounds, Victoria. It's a strange change of pace to be the one closing them." He looked up, and for the first time, the distance between the Dawn and the Maid vanished completely. His dark eyes were filled with an intensity that made the air in the kitchen feel thick and sweet. There was no music, only the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of their shared breathing, but as he pulled her closer to inspect the bandage, it felt like a dance. Every movement was deliberate, a slow, rhythmic pull of attraction that had been simmering since that first drop of water hit his shoe. He didn't let go of her hand once the bandage was secure. Instead, he brought her palm to his lips, his gaze locked on hers. The kiss was light, a ghost of a sensation, but it sent a fire through Victoria's veins that no clinical textbook could explain. "I told you that you were a distraction," Simone whispered against her skin. "I was wrong. You aren't a distraction, Victoria. You're a revelation." In the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by the scent of expensive copper pans and his intoxicating cologne, Victoria realized that the danger wasn't just the assassins outside the gates. The real danger was the way her heart leaned into the man who had once tried to erase her, finding a home in the arms of a monster who was learning how to be a man again. The morning sun crept across the nursery-turned-infirmary, but the warmth did not reach Victoria's heart as she watched the matriarch sleep. Something was wrong. Despite the stabilization, the elderly woman's pulse was dipping again into a sluggish, treacherous rhythm. Victoria turned her attention to the nightstand, where a small silver tray held a glass of water and a single pearlescent pill, the maintenance heart medication Enzo, the Consigliere, had hand-delivered only an hour before. Victoria picked up the tablet, turning it over in her palm. Her medical training was a library of chemical structures, and her intuition began to scream. She remembered the scent on Enzo's hands in the kitchen, a faint, bitter metallic odor, and the way he had hovered with practiced concern while the matriarch swallowed the previous dose. She looked at the woman's eyes again. The yellow tint was deepening, a phenomenon known as xanthopsia, which signaled that the toxin wasn't leaving her system, it was being replenished. With a heavy heart, Victoria realized the medicine was a Trojan horse. To the untrained eye, it looked like standard digoxin, but the texture was too chalky, the imprint slightly off-aired. It was a concentrated digitalis extract disguised as life-saving care. Enzo wasn't just a bystander, he was the chemist of this tragedy. Viewers must understand the cold brilliance of this method. In a medical emergency, the goal is to stabilize the patient's electrolytes, particularly potassium. In the body, potassium and digitalis compete for the same binding sites on the heart's sodium-potassium pump. When potassium levels are low, the poison has more room to latch onto the heart cells, making the toxicity far more lethal. By providing a medicine that was actually a poison, Enzo was ensuring that even as Victoria fought to save her, the heart would eventually reach a point of no return, an irreversible stone heart state where the muscle simply refuses to relax. Victoria felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. If she stopped the medication, she would be accused of negligence. If she continued it, she was a silent accomplice to murder. She heard the click of polished shoes on the marble floor and looked up to see Enzo standing in the doorway, his smile a perfect mask of loyalty. "Is it time for her dose, Victoria?" he asked, his voice smooth and empty. At that moment, she didn't look at him with the fear of a maid. She tucked the pill into her pocket, hiding the evidence against her skin, and met his gaze with the steely resolve of a woman who had finally found the enemy. The war for the DeRose family had moved from the streets to the medicine cabinet, and Victoria Grace was the only one who knew that the gift of life was actually a sentence of death. The heavy silence of the villa was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic, muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire echoing from the lower floors. Victoria's breath hitched as the bedroom door flew open. It wasn't Enzo with a pill, but Simone, his eyes wild and his shirt stained with a spray of crimson that wasn't his own. Before she could speak, his hand clamped over her mouth, and he hauled her toward a hidden seam in the mahogany paneling of the hallway. They tumbled into the narrow, steel-lined confines of the panic room just as a volley of bullets shredded the wood where they had stood seconds before. The heavy door hissed shut, sealing them in a tomb of shadows and high-tech monitors. Outside, the monitors showed masked men, Enzo's mercenaries, tearing through the suite. Victoria collapsed against the cold metal wall, her lungs burning. The reality of her situation crashed down. She was no longer just a disgraced medic or a maid, she was the target of a coup. Simone was beside her in an instant, his large frame crowding her into the corner. He was checking a rack of weapons, but his hands, usually so steady, were rigid with a fury that bordered on despair. "He took everything from me," Simone hissed, his voice a jagged edge in the dark. "My loyalty, my mother's health, and now he wants to take the only light I've found in this hell." He turned to her then, his face inches from hers. The air in the small room was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the intoxicating heat of their proximity. Victoria looked at the man who was supposed to be a monster, seeing instead a protector who was bleeding for her. The fear that had been paralyzing her transformed into a desperate, electric need to feel alive. She reached out, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him down. Simone didn't hesitate. He crashed his lips against hers with a hunger that was both a plea and a vow. It was a desperate, bruised kiss, tasting of copper and salt, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. In that dark, fortified box, while the world outside burned with betrayal, Simone held her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "If we die tonight, Victoria," he whispered against her lips, "know that you were the only one who truly saw me." Victoria gripped his shoulders, her heart racing not from the poison in the house, but from the man in her arms. "We aren't dying, Simone. I've saved your mother's heart, now I'm going to help you take back your empire." The kiss had been a seal, a promise that the maid and the mobster were no longer on opposite sides. They were a single, lethal force, waiting for the door to open. The tension in the grand dining hall was thick enough to choke the breath from a man's lungs. Simone stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife, his eyes like flint as he looked at the gathered couples of the DeRose family. Beside him, Victoria stood tall, her maid's uniform replaced by a dark silk dress that couldn't hide the clinical steel in her gaze. Enzo sat at the far end, his hands folded neatly, a mask of perfect, mournful loyalty on his face. "You accuse me, the man who carried you as a child, on the word of a servant?" Enzo's voice was a smooth, practiced baritone. "The girl is confused, Simone. Perhaps the trauma of the attack has clouded her mind. She is a maid, not a chemist." Victoria stepped forward, the silence in the room expanding like a void. She didn't look at the guns or the hardened men, she looked at the small, digital recorder she placed on the table. A maid is invisible, Enzo. That is your mistake. You think we are furniture, that we don't hear the rustle of paper or notice the specific metallic scent of digitalis extract on a sleeve. She pressed play. The audio was grainy, muffled by the fabric of a pocket, but the voices were unmistakable. It was the sound of Enzo in the private clinic, his voice cold and devoid of its usual warmth, speaking to a contact on the phone. The dose is increased. The maid is the perfect scapegoat. By the time the heart block is irreversible, Simone will be too broken to lead, and the medicine will have finished what the guns couldn't. Enzo's face didn't just pale, it turned the color of bone. The capos shifted, their chairs scraping against the marble like a collective growl. Digitalis toxicity is a slow, cruel way to kill, Victoria said, her voice echoing with the authority of the doctor she was born to be. It turns the world yellow before it turns it black. You didn't just want her dead, you wanted her to suffer so you could manipulate her son's grief. But the final blow didn't come from Victoria. From the doorway, supported by 2 loyal guards, the matriarch herself appeared. Her steps were slow, but her eyes were clear, the yellow haze finally purged from her vision. I heard you that morning, Enzo, she rasped, her voice a ghost of its former power but filled with the weight of an empress. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, but I felt the poison you tucked under my tongue. I felt your betrayal in every failing beat of my heart. Simone didn't shout. He didn't roar. He simply looked at Enzo with a terrifying, quiet finality. The evidence was absolute. A fusion of medical science and the testimony of the woman who had returned from the brink. The invisible maid had done more than scrub floors, she had recorded a confession and diagnosed a conspiracy. As the guards moved to seize the traitor, Simone reached out and took Victoria's hand, acknowledging her not as a witness, but as the savior of his bloodline. The truth had been spoken, and in the house of DeRose, the truth always came with a price. The golden light of a late Roman afternoon bathed the Piazza Navona, turning the fountains into liquid fire and the ancient stones into a warm, amber stage. Victoria Grace walked through the center of the square, her stride no longer the hurried, apologetic shuffle of a woman trying to disappear. She wore a tailored wool coat that brushed against her knees, and the stethoscope draped around her neck was no longer a hidden relic of a lost dream, it was a badge of her restored identity. Beside her, matching her pace with a protective, lethal grace, was Simone DeRose. He didn't touch her, yet the air between them was thick with a new, settled kind of affection. The man who had once tried to erase her with a single, cold word now held the world at bay so she could breathe. When a group of tourists strayed too close, Simone didn't need to bark an order, he simply shifted his weight, his dark eyes flashing a warning that made the crowd part like the Red Sea. He wasn't just her lover, he was her shield, the guardian of the healer he had nearly destroyed. They passed the high-end cleaning agency where Victoria had once begged for extra shifts. Through the glass, she saw her old supervisor, a man who had treated her like a disposable tool. When he caught sight of her, flanked by the most feared man in Italy, her head held high and her eyes bright with purpose, his jaw dropped, the clipboard slipping from his hands. Victoria didn't stop. She didn't feel the need to gloat. The triumph wasn't in his fear, but in her own freedom. You're thinking about the first day, Simone murmured, his voice a warm vibration near her ear. I'm thinking about the water spot, Victoria replied, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. If I hadn't been careless that morning, your mother wouldn't be sitting in the garden right now, and I'd still be scrubbing marble instead of saving lives. Simone stopped, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. The kiss was slow, public, and filled with a fierce possessiveness that made Victoria feel more seen than she ever had in a lecture hall. I was a fool, he admitted softly. I thought you were a smudge on the glass. I didn't realize you were the only thing worth looking at. As they walked toward the new clinic Simone had purchased for her, a state-of-the-art facility where she could treat the city's forgotten without fear of documentation, Victoria realized that her unthinkable act hadn't just saved a matriarch. It had mended the broken anatomy of a family and jump-started a heart that had been cold for far too long. She was no longer a maid, and he was no longer just a monster. In the heart of Rome, amidst the shadows and the light, the doctor had finally found her home. Thank you so much for watching till the end. It truly means a lot to me. If this video touched your heart or resonated with you in any way, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to Favy Love Stories. Your support helps us reach more souls on this journey. Until next time, take care.